The polished silver trays felt like lead in her hands, each one a heavy reminder of the distance between the life she dreamed of and the one she currently lived. Outside the towering glass doors of Le Monde Étrange, the strange world, lay a city pulsing with possibilities, a city she longed to conquer with her art. But inside, among the hushed clinking of cutlery and the condescending gazes of the elite, she was just Nia, the waitress. The air itself felt crisp and cold, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and thinly veiled disdain. It clung to her humble uniform, a stark contrast to the vibrant colors she poured onto canvas in the quiet solitude of her tiny apartment. This place, with its ornate decor and impossibly high ceilings, was supposed to be a step up, a way to fund her passion. Instead, it often felt like a prison, the bars forged from judgment and exclusion. Every dropped fork echoed like thunder. Every spilled drop felt like a personal failure, amplified for public amusement. This wasn't just a job, it was a daily test of endurance in a world that wasn't built for her, where her aspirations felt invisible against the backdrop of casual cruelty. Can she navigate the treacherous currents of this strange world? Can she find the strength to rise above the shadows cast by others' prejudice and finally seize the vibrant future she so desperately paints in her mind? Like this video and subscribe to join Nia on her journey as she fights for her dreams against overwhelming odds. Nia gripped the tray, the weight pressing into her palms. Just 19, fresh out of high school with a scholarship deferred, she had envisioned a life painted with broad, confident strokes. A life dedicated to her art, to expressing the vivid stories held within her community. Stories often unseen, unheard. She saw canvases filled with the joy of neighborhood block parties, the quiet strength of the elders on their porches, the fiery passion of young artists finding their voice. Her small room back home was a testament to this dream. Walls covered in sketches, canvases stacked precariously, smelling of turpentine and hope. But New York was expensive. Rent was a relentless tide, and art supplies didn't materialize from thin air. So she traded her paint-stained jeans for the crisp, starched apron of Le Monde Étrange, a place renowned for its exquisite cuisine and its even more exquisite clientele. The interview had been a blur of promising words about potential and growth. The reality was a daily immersion into a culture that felt utterly alien and frequently hostile. The other waitstaff, mostly older, seasoned professionals, moved with an almost surgical precision, their faces often set in masks of weary patience or outright annoyance. She felt clumsy, slow, and perpetually out of place, like a splash of vibrant color in a room painted in shades of gray and taupe. Their whispers, sharp as shards of glass, seemed to follow her from the kitchen to the dining floor.
Watch yourself, new girl. This isn't some greasy spoon diner.
The maitre d', a man whose smile never quite reached his cold eyes, had corrected her pronunciation of a dish 3 times in front of a table of impatient guests, his tone laced with barely concealed contempt.
It's escargots, miss, not escargots. Perhaps listen more carefully next time.
The heat in her cheeks wasn't from the kitchen. It was the slow burn of humiliation. She yearned for the familiar, comforting smells of home cooking, the sound of laughter that wasn't forced or polite, the feeling of belonging. Here, the air tasted of privilege and smelled of indifference. She was the outsider, the one who didn't fit, her every movement scrutinized, her every mistake magnified. The dreams that burned so brightly within her felt impossibly far away, obscured by the imposing facade of this strange, unwelcoming world. She was the underdog, standing alone in the heart of the lion's den, armed with little more than her determination and the fading echo of her artistic aspirations. The air in the bustling cafe was thick with the sweet scent of pastries and bitter coffee, a cloying perfume that usually masked the subtle discomfort. But today, for Maya, the scent felt heavy, oppressive. She glided between tables, a practiced, polite smile fixed firmly on her face, balancing a tray laden with steaming mugs and delicate china. Yet, beneath the surface of crisp uniform and effortless grace, a familiar tension coiled in her gut. It wasn't the rush that tightened her muscles. It was the way some eyes lingered too long, the subtle hesitations before a request was made, the questions that felt more like challenges. Just then, a woman at table 7, draped in expensive fabric, beckoned her over. Maya approached, smile still in place, notepad ready.
Is everything all right with your order?
Maya asked, her voice smooth and professional, the tone honed over years of practice. The woman pursed her lips, her gaze sweeping over Maya, lingering for a fraction too long before landing on the tray.
Yes, it's fine. Just surprising you understood. Usually, it takes a while for some people to grasp complex orders.
The words dripped with a sugary condescension that left a bitter taste in the air, sharper than any espresso. Maya felt a hot flush crawl up her neck. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the notepad, the cheap paper threatening to tear. She forced the smile wider, the muscles in her cheeks aching.
I assure you, I'm quite capable of handling orders of any complexity.
Her voice remained level, but the slight tremor beneath the surface was a betrayal only she could feel. Later, retreating to the sanctuary of the kitchen, the clatter of pans and the hiss of the espresso machine did little to soothe the sting. James, a fellow server whose easy camaraderie with others never seemed to extend fully to her, leaned against the counter, polishing glasses with unnecessary vigor. He watched her put away the notepad, a lazy smirk playing on his lips.
Tough crowd out there, huh? Gotta be careful not to mess up. Wouldn't want to confuse anyone.
His tone was light, teasing, but his eyes held a knowing, dismissive glint that mirrored the customer's. It was the constant low hum of doubt, the implication that she was inherently less capable, less intelligent. It chipped away at her, piece by agonizing piece. Maya turned slowly, her gaze meeting his. The polite mask was momentarily forgotten. She felt the anger flare, a quick, sharp heat in her chest. This wasn't just banter. It was a constant, subtle push to keep her in a box they had constructed for her. The conflict, long simmering beneath the forced smiles and polite acknowledgments, began to bubble closer to the surface. She didn't respond to James, couldn't trust herself to speak without the carefully constructed facade cracking. She simply walked away, the tight knot in her stomach pulling tighter, the quiet hum of resentment beginning to build into a low, dangerous growl. The air still smelled of coffee, but now the cloying sweetness seemed tainted with the acrid scent of injustice. The air in the bustling kitchen grew thick with unspoken tension as the dinner rush peaked. Maria moved with practiced efficiency, her hands stained with the day's work, but her heart felt heavy, weighted down by the palpable sense of being perpetually scrutinized. This shift, more than others, felt different. It wasn't just the usual sidelong glances or curt instructions. There was a coiled expectancy in the atmosphere, as if Everyone, from the line cooks to the servers hovering near the pass, was collectively waiting for her to falter. The heat from the grills seemed to press down on her, amplifying the internal pressure she felt. It happened around 8 o'clock, a crucial point in the service. A major table's main courses were significantly delayed, leaving the front of house in a panic. The head chef bellowed from the pass, his face red, demanding answers and solutions immediately. Sarah, one of the long-term staff members who had never quite accepted Maria, pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at her.
It's her. She messed up the prep rotation on the salmon. That's why it's not ready.
The accusation hung in the humid air, sharp and cutting, silencing the frantic clatter of pans for a beat. Maria's breath hitched in her chest, a sudden, painful constriction. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the rotation sheet had been deliberately altered sometime during the mid-shift chaos. A subtle, almost undetectable change she had noticed but dismissed earlier, thinking it a simple error in transcription. Now it was clear. It was a weapon, placed with malicious intent. All eyes turned to her, a dozen faces ranging from openly hostile to carefully neutral. The commis chefs averted their gazes, unwilling to get involved, their faces a blur of calculated indifference. The other servers exchanged knowing looks. A silent verdict passed without a single word of inquiry or defense. In that moment, the kitchen wasn't just a workplace. It was an arena designed for her public humiliation, and she was the outsider, isolated in the searing spotlight of blame. A flush of heat rose to her cheeks, not just from the intense glow of the ovens, but from shame and indignation that burned deeper than any physical heat. She felt the weight of every whispered word, every subtle exclusion she had experienced since starting here. The ignored greetings, the break-room conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered. The knowing smiles exchanged behind her back, converge on her like a physical press. This was the crushing price of not belonging, the silent agreement that she would always be the convenient scapegoat, the other in their exclusive world. Sarah pressed her advantage, stepping closer, her voice dripping with a saccharine, feigned concern that masked pure, unadulterated malice.
Honestly, Chef, some people just aren't cut out for this pace. Or maybe they just don't care enough to check properly. It's affecting all of us, the whole team.
The implication hung heavy in the air, like suffocating smoke. She was incompetent, lazy, and utterly unworthy of being part of their tight-knit team. The conflict, which had simmered beneath the surface for weeks, now boiled over. A toxic brew fueled by a deliberate lie and the collective silent agreement of the exclusive few. Maria wanted desperately to speak, to defend herself against the blatant lie, to point out the telltale alteration on the sheet, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by the sheer unfairness of it all. The injustice felt like a physical blow, stealing her voice and her strength simultaneously. She was trapped, not by her mistakes, but by their calculated exclusion, pinned beneath the weight of exclusivity they had so carefully constructed around her. The kitchen, typically a place of vibrant noise and frantic energy, suddenly felt cold and unnaturally silent around her, amplifying her isolation into a screaming void. She could almost taste the metallic tang of fear and injustice on her tongue, sharp and acrid. The air, heavy with the rich smells of roasting meat, sautéed garlic, and aromatic herbs, for Maria held only the bitter, suffocating scent of betrayal and being unwanted. The tension was a living, breathing entity, wrapping around her, constricting her ability to take a full breath. She was utterly alone, surrounded by a hostile, silent crowd in the very place she had hoped to build a future. The scent of freshly brewed coffee usually offered a comforting warmth, but today it seemed to curdle the air as a sudden, sharp voice cut through the pleasant murmur of afternoon customers. All heads turned. The bright lights of the store, moments before just functional, now felt like blinding spotlights, converging solely on her. She stood frozen, a tray of delicate pastries clutched precariously in her trembling hands. A chill deeper than any air conditioning unit traced its way down her spine. The assistant manager, Mark, a man whose smirking demeanor often felt like a low hum of aggression, stood near the register, gesturing towards a display case with exaggerated dismay. Customers paused, their eyes following his pointing finger, then landing on her. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She hadn't done anything. What was happening? The polite chatter faded, replaced by an expectant, heavy silence. Every pair of eyes felt like a pinprick on her skin.
There! Look at this mess! Broken glass all over the counter, and a whole display tray ruined.
His voice boomed, laced with performative outrage, loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear.
Who was the last one near this section? Who was responsible for stocking here just minutes ago?
You didn't need to name her. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like stale smoke. Her breath hitched. She hadn't been near that case since her shift started hours ago, and it had been perfectly fine then. This was impossible. A wave of nausea washed over her, making the colorful pastries in her hands blur. The polished floor suddenly felt slick and unstable beneath her feet.
But I wasn't. I haven't touched that case, Mr. Henderson. Not since this morning.
Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with disbelief and a rising tide of panic. Mark's eyes narrowed, his smirk returning, but colder now, more cruel. Sarah, another colleague who seemed to relish any chance to see her stumble, giggled from behind the counter.
Oh, please! Like you're the only one who's not touched something when things go wrong. Someone did this, and you were right there.
Sarah's voice drilled with sarcasm, solidifying the public verdict before any facts could surface. The blood rushed to her cheeks, hot with humiliation, then drained away, leaving her clammy and weak. She could feel the stares, the silent judgments. A few customers looked away awkwardly, but others watched, their expressions ranging from pity to open curiosity. The broken glass glinted under the harsh lights, a physical manifestation of the accusation shattering her fragile sense of safety. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This wasn't just a mistake. This felt deliberate, a public execution of her reputation, orchestrated for an audience of strangers and colleagues who were now witnesses to her deepest fear, being unjustly condemned. The air grew thin, stealing her breath, leaving her stranded in the blinding glare of the unfair spotlight. The sterile linoleum felt cold against her cheek, a stark contrast to the burning humiliation that still scalded her skin. A tremor ran through her, not of cold, but of pure, unadulterated shock. She lay there for a long moment, the echoes of laughter and cruel words still ringing in her ears like a discordant bell. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened, the public dismantling of her dignity, the casual cruelty delivered with chilling precision. It couldn't be real. This wasn't happening. But the metallic taste of fear and despair coating her tongue, the scent of her own nervous sweat, told her it was achingly, brutally real. Then came the shame, a tidal wave crashing over her, drowning out everything else. It pooled heavy in her gut, crawled like 1,000 ants across her limbs. She felt exposed, vulnerable, every flaw magnified under the harsh glare of memory. The way their eyes had gleamed, the smirk playing on a face that had once seemed kind. Each detail was a shard of glass twisting in the wound. Hurt followed, sharp and piercing, a betrayal so profound it stole her breath. These were people she had trusted, people she had worked alongside, yet they had stripped her bare and left her for ridicule. A hot, fierce flicker of anger ignited deep within her chest, a desperate, frantic pulse against the crushing weight. How could they? How dare they? But the anger was fleeting, quickly suffocated by the sheer magnitude of her brokenness. The weight of the event settled upon her like a mountain, pressing down on her chest until breathing became a shallow, painful struggle. It wasn't just her reputation that was bruised. Her spirit felt shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces, scattered across that cold, unforgiving floor. Hope, once a sturdy flame within her, flickered weakly, then died, leaving only a vast, empty darkness. Despair, cold and absolute, wrapped around her like a shroud. What was the point? Where could she go from here? How could she ever look anyone in the eye again? The future, which had held tentative promise just moments before, now stretched out like a barren wasteland, devoid of light, devoid of possibility. She closed her eyes, wishing she could simply fade away, disappear from existence, and leave the shattered remnants of herself behind. The silence of the empty room was deafening now, amplifying the sound of her own ragged, silent sobs. The air in the bustling market square, usually thick with the aroma of spices and fresh bread, now carried the biting scent of public shame. It clung to the cobblestones, heavy and suffocating. People averted their gazes, or worse, stared, with a cruel fascination as the scene unfolded. Her small frame trembled under the weight of the glares and the venomous words being hurled like stones. The fabric of her simple dress felt like sandpaper against her skin, itchy and degrading under the intense scrutiny.
Look at her. Thinks she's too good for us, does she? With her fancy notions?
The words, sharp and laced with malice, cut through the murmur of the crowd.
Yeah, trying to cheat her way through. Thought we wouldn't notice? Pathetic.
A rough hand gestured dismissively, drawing more eyes to her plight. Tears burned in her eyes, blurring the faces around her into indistinct, judgmental shapes. A lump formed in her throat, thick with fear and injustice. She wanted to cry out, to defend herself, to explain, but the words were trapped, suffocated by the sheer cruelty of the moment. The sounds of their laughter, harsh and triumphant, echoed in her ears, a symphony of degradation. The touch of the cool, unforgiving stone beneath her bare feet was a small grounding discomfort amidst the emotional storm. Yet, unseen amidst the jeering crowd, nestled perhaps on a balcony overlooking the square, were seated quietly at a less conspicuous table in a nearby cafe, was an observer. He was a man of discernible presence, though his attire might have been deliberately understated. His eyes, keen and intelligent, didn't flicker away with the casual cruelty of others. They watched, absorbing every detail. The flushed face of the accused, the triumphant sneers of the accusers, the passive acceptance of the onlookers. This wasn't just any observer. This was a man who would, in the coming years, become a name synonymous with power, with influence, with vast wealth. A tycoon whose decisions would shape industries. He wasn't there to witness this particular act of humiliation, but fate had placed him there. He saw the raw, unfair power dynamic at play, the blatant disregard for truth in favor of public spectacle. He saw the vulnerability, the quiet suffering, the spirit that refused to break entirely, despite the overwhelming pressure. His face remained impassive, revealing nothing of the thoughts swirling within him. No outward sign betrayed his presence. No cough, no shifting in his seat. He was a ghost in the gallery of this public theater of cruelty. But his mind was active, cataloging, analyzing. He saw not just a scene of petty cruelty, but a demonstration of character, or lack thereof, from everyone involved. And in the young woman standing exposed and humiliated, he saw something others missed entirely, something that sparked a flicker of intrigue in the depths of his experienced gaze. The world was vast, filled with countless injustices. But sometimes, just sometimes, an unseen witness was watching. The world outside the window faded into a blur of indifferent streetlights. Inside, the silence was a suffocating blanket, broken only by the ragged sound of her own breath. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving behind an emptiness that echoed in her chest. This wasn't just hitting a low point. This felt like crashing through the floor, past the foundation, into cold, hard rock. The taste in her mouth was bitter, like ash and defeat. She slumped onto the worn sofa. The cheap fabric scratchy against her skin, a small sharp discomfort lost in the overwhelming avalanche of dread. Every thought was a question mark, heavy with potential disaster. What now? The incident replayed in her mind, a sickening loop of accusation and vulnerability. Her job, the one fragile anchor in her life, now felt like it was slipping away. Would the call come tomorrow? An email with cold, professional language terminating her position? The thought sent a tremor through her, cold and sharp as a splinter of ice. Losing the job wasn't just about income. It was about losing her foothold, her identity, the small bit of stability she'd fought so hard to build. The walls of her small apartment seemed to close in, the air growing thin with fear. She looked around at the familiar, slightly shabby room and felt a profound sense of disconnection. This was her life, and it felt utterly out of her control, careening towards ruin. How could she possibly navigate this? How could she fight a battle when she was already disarmed, exposed, and battered? The path forward wasn't just unclear. It seemed to have vanished entirely, leaving her stranded in a wasteland of consequences. The title of underdog, once a source of defiant pride, now felt like a permanent brand, a mark of predestined failure. It wasn't just a temporary struggle anymore. It felt like her inherent state, a position she was destined to occupy forever. The power dynamics felt insurmountable, the deck stacked too high, the forces against her too vast and uncaring. Hope wasn't just distant. It was a faint, unattainable star in a sky choked with darkness. She closed her eyes, the weight of her circumstances pressing down, heavy and suffocating. The fight seemed over before it had truly begun, leaving her with nothing but the cold certainty of rock bottom. The air hung thick and heavy with the scent of impending rain as she hurried along the familiar street. Her thoughts were a jumble of worried scenarios, the weight of her predicament pressing down like the humid atmosphere. She wasn't paying much attention, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond her worn shoes, until a sudden stillness in the periphery caught her eye. Her heart gave a violent lurch, stumbling against her ribs. Standing across the street, Near the entrance to a small, cluttered antique shop was the woman. The woman from the restaurant. The one whose eyes had seemed to pierce through the carefully constructed facade of politeness and cruelty that day. She was dressed simply, in clothes that seemed ordinary, yet there was an intensity about her posture, a silent watchfulness that felt anything but casual. Their eyes met across the asphalt divide, and in that instant, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. There was no smile on the woman's face, no wave of recognition. Just that same unnerving gaze, deep and knowing. It wasn't hostile, not exactly, but it held a profound, unsettling recognition that chilled the air around her despite the mugginess. It was the look of someone who saw not just the surface, but the hidden currents, the unspoken burdens she carried. A sudden gust of wind whipped leaves and debris around their ankles, rustling through the branches of an old oak tree nearby. The sound a low, sibilant whisper in the sudden tension. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. She simply stood there, a silent, enigmatic sentinel. Panic flared hot and fast. Why was this woman here? Was she following her? Did she know something? The brief encounter at the restaurant had felt like a fleeting moment, a pair of sympathetic eyes in a room full of indifferent ones. But this felt deliberate. This felt like a thread being pulled, a silent acknowledgement of the injustice she faced, an acknowledgement from someone she didn't know and couldn't understand. The woman's lips parted slightly, perhaps to speak, perhaps just a trick of the light or her own heightened anxiety. But before any sound could escape, a noisy truck rumbled past, momentarily breaking the visual connection. When the roar faded, the spot where the woman had stood was empty. She was gone as suddenly and silently as she had appeared. She stood frozen, the sounds of the street, distant sirens, the chatter of passers-by, the drip, drip, drip of the first heavy raindrops hitting the pavement, returning in a rush. The lingering image of that piercing gaze was seared into her mind. Who was she? What did she want? The encounter, brief and utterly baffling, left a cold knot of fear and intense curiosity tightening in her stomach. It felt less like a chance meeting and more like a sign, an unknowable element entering her already turbulent world, escalating the sense of being watched, the growing certainty that her fight was far from unseen. The air in the small, sterile room hummed with a tension that felt thicker than blood. Every nerve in her body was frayed, expecting nothing more than bureaucratic indifference or another dead end. Then, the figure across the polished table, who had until moments ago been obscured by shadow and protocol, slowly leaned forward. A name was spoken, one that resonated not with the quiet desperation of her world, but with headlines and power. It was a name she knew, a name associated with immense influence, someone she had only ever seen on screens or in hushed, reverent tones. The witness wasn't just the witness, he was the witness. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She blinked, sure her eyes were playing tricks. The man who held her fate, the key to potentially unlocking the chains of injustice that bound her, wasn't a colleague or a legal aid, but a figure of almost mythic authority in the city's landscape. He looked nothing like the caricatures the media painted, his face etched with a quiet, almost sorrowful resolve rather than ruthless ambition. A faint scent of old paper and expensive leather clung to him, a stark contrast to the cheap disinfectant smell of the room. He spoke then, his voice a low, steady rumble, devoid of the expected official ease.
I saw what happened. All of it. And I have the power to not only confirm your account, but to reshape the entire narrative. More than that.
He paused, his gaze meeting hers directly, holding it with unwavering intensity. The weight of the world felt lifted and replaced by something else, something terrifyingly hopeful.
I am prepared to offer you a position, a significant role within my own organization. It will give you resources, influence, and the platform you deserve to ensure this never happens again to anyone else. It's a chance to turn this injustice into undeniable strength.
An offer? A job? Not just validation, but elevation? The words tumbled out, unbelievable, absurd against the backdrop of her reality, which had been defined by struggle, dismissal, and the suffocating pressure of being an underdog. Her throat tightened, tasting like dust and disbelief.
But I have nothing. I've lost everything.
Her voice was barely a whisper, raw with emotion and the lingering taste of despair. The worn fabric of her simple dress felt suddenly conspicuous, a symbol of her recent ruin in this room of quiet power. He offered a small, understanding smile.
Precisely. You understand loss. You understand injustice. That gives you everything needed for this. This isn't charity. It's strategic. Your experience is invaluable. This is your opportunity, not just for justice, but for a new beginning. An undeniable rise.
The air thickened again, not with tension, but with possibility. It hung in the space between them, vibrant and almost tangible, shimmering like a mirage that had suddenly become real. This wasn't the path she'd expected. It was a sudden, steep climb toward a horizon she hadn't dared to dream existed. It defied her every expectation, shattered her current reality, and laid bare an astonishing, unbelievable proposition. The twist had arrived, not as a sudden fall, but as an unexpected, breathtaking ascent. Disbelief settled over her like a shroud, cold and heavy. She sat across from the man whose name was synonymous with impossible wealth, a bitter taste of skepticism filling her mouth. It felt like a cruel, elaborate joke, a phantom limb of hope offered only to be snatched away, much like everything else good in her life seemed destined to be. Her hands, calloused from years of scrubbing floors and polishing surfaces that weren't her own, clenched tight in her lap. The rough texture of her dress, a stark contrast to the plush velvet of the chair beneath her. Fear, a familiar serpent coiled in her gut, whispering warnings of hidden traps and inevitable disappointment. She had been burned before, left scorched and fragile, and the faint, almost imperceptible scent of money in the air felt less like opportunity and more like the smoke from previous fires. Why her? A simple question that echoed in the vast, silent chambers of her mind. What interest could a man like him possibly have in someone like her? Past hurts surfaced unbidden, the dismissive looks, the broken promises, the casual cruelty that had become the backdrop of her existence. Hope was a dangerous indulgence, a fragile bird she had learned to keep caged deep inside, lest it be crushed by the harsh realities of the world. The very idea of his offer felt alien, impossible, a shimmering mirage in the desert of her despair. He watched her, his expression calm, almost unnerving in its steadiness. There was no pity in his gaze, no condescension, only a quiet intensity that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed walls. He leaned forward slightly, the movement deliberate, commanding attention without force.
Your skepticism is understandable, given everything. I've seen your file, read your story.
His voice was deep, resonant, like stones shifting in a riverbed. It carried the weight of authority, yet lacked the sharp edge she expected.
I didn't build an empire by ignoring potential or by turning a blind eye to injustice when it crosses my path. Your situation is not just a case of hardship. It is a clear, documented pattern of abuse of power. It offends my sense of order, my belief in fairness.
He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The quiet hum of the building's sophisticated climate control was the only sound, a steady pulse beneath the dramatic tension of the moment.
My motive is simple, if perhaps surprising. I have the resources, the influence, and frankly the inclination to rectify situations like this. Think of it as an investment, not just in you, but in the principle that such actions should not stand unchallenged. My vision is a world where people are judged by their merit and character, not by the arbitrary whims of those who hold temporary power. You, with your resilience, your documented integrity in the face of immense pressure, represent that principle. I see the potential for something extraordinary.
He spoke with a conviction that chipped away, slowly, tentatively, at the hardened shell around her heart. It wasn't charity he offered, but a partnership based on a shared, though perhaps unequally resourced, desire for justice. Could it be real? The fragile bird of hope stirred, a tiny flutter deep within her chest, weak but undeniably present. The fear remained, a cold weight, but it was now accompanied by a tentative, almost frightening possibility. The polished mahogany desk felt cool under her fingertips, a stark contrast to the worn, chipped surfaces she was used to. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent symphony of possibility in a world that had once felt only gray and cold. Under the guidance of the man who had offered her a lifeline, she began to rebuild, piece by painstaking piece. The air in his study smelled faintly of old books and expensive leather, a scent that now felt less intimidating and more like a promise. Hours melted into days, days into weeks. She devoured knowledge like a starved soul finding sustenance. Legal texts, business strategies, the subtle art of negotiation. Words and concepts that had once seemed like an impenetrable fortress now began to yield their secrets under his calm, steady tutelage. He didn't just lecture, he encouraged questions, patiently unraveling complexity with a quiet authority that inspired rather than overwhelmed. Sometimes he would lean back in his chair, eyes thoughtful, and offer a perspective she had never considered.
Understanding the game is the first step, young woman, but mastering it requires knowing your own strengths, the ones they tried so hard to bury.
His words were not just instruction, they were affirmation. With each new skill acquired, each knot of ignorance untangled, a layer of the old humiliation began to peel away. The constant ache in her chest, the phantom weight of public ridicule and betrayal, lessened. She felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime. The taste of shame, acrid and ever-present, started to fade, replaced by the crisp, clean sensation of potential. She practiced speaking, shedding the hesitant mumbles, finding her voice, a voice that had been silenced for too long. She studied her reflection, no longer seeing just the victim, but a woman gaining clarity, strength returning to her eyes like a rekindled flame. The expensive fabrics of the clothes provided felt less like a disguise and more like an armor, protecting the fragile, growing confidence within. This wasn't merely survival. This was blossoming. This was the slow, deliberate ascent from the depths, the first sure steps onto a path carved not by fate or malice, but by her own burgeoning will and the quiet support of a hand extended in kindness. The rise had begun. The scent of freshly baked bread, a comforting smell usually, suddenly turned stale in her nostrils. She was browsing local produce at the farmer's market, a weekly ritual on her new path, when she saw them. Across a display of vibrant peppers stood two figures, their faces a jarring flashback to a life she was desperately trying to leave behind. Marcus, her former manager, and Tina, a coworker whose smile had always felt like a predator's baring teeth. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. They spotted her, and the market's cheerful buzz seemed to dim, replaced by the faint echoes of slammed kitchen doors and hushed, cruel whispers. They sauntered over, their movements too casual, too deliberate. Marcus spoke first, a forced cheerfulness that didn't reach his eyes.
Well, well, look who it is. Gloria, right? Fancy seeing you slumming it out here with the artisans.
He gestured vaguely at the stalls with a condescending tilt of his head. Tina snickered, her gaze raking over Gloria's simple, comfortable clothes with undisguised contempt.
Thought you were too good for us now, Gloria. All high and mighty with your little whatever this is.
She gestured dismissively towards Gloria's basket of vegetables. The words stung, not just for their current nastiness, but for the years of subtle and not-so-subtle barbs they represented. The old restaurant kitchen hadn't just cooked food. It had simmered with resentment, a bitter broth brewed daily from jealousy and insecurity. They had mocked her dreams, dismissed her efforts, and reveled in her struggles. Now that she had dared to find a new path, even a difficult one, they couldn't stand it. This wasn't just an encounter. It was a declaration that the past wasn't willing to let her go. Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping slightly, though still loud enough for nearby shoppers to potentially overhear.
Heard things weren't exactly booming with your little venture. Still trying to prove everyone wrong, huh? Some people just aren't cut out for more than flipping burgers.
The deliberate cruelty of his words, hitting on the very core of her past humiliation and current struggle, was a calculated blow. Tina added her poison.
Remember that time you burnt the sauce? Or when you dropped the whole tray of glasses? Some things never change, I guess.
Her voice dripped with malicious glee, dredging up moments of failure that had been weaponized against her then and were being used again now. A tremor ran through Gloria, a mix of old fear and rising indignation. The vibrant colors of the market blurred as the ghosts of her past swirled around her. Their words were not just opinions. They were chains, forged in years of doubt and dismissal, trying to shackle her back to the person they believed she was destined to remain. The air suddenly felt thick, suffocating, filled with the sour taste of old betrayals. This wasn't just doubt. It was an active attempt to undermine her confidence, to chip away at the fragile foundation of her new life, ensuring the conflict wasn't confined to the past, but was escalating, finding new ground to torment her. They wanted to drag her back into the shadows they inhabited, unwilling to see her stand even a little taller. The fight, it seemed, was far from over. The map of the sprawling corporate headquarters lay spread across the desk, marked with hurried notations and circled areas. Alara traced lines with a finger, her eyes sharp, absorbing every detail she had meticulously gathered. Blueprints, outdated but still largely accurate, sat beside piles of financial reports and archived memos, each document a piece of the intricate puzzle she had spent months assembling in the shadows. The air in her small study was thick with the scent of old paper and the lingering aroma of coffee brewed hours ago, fuel for countless sleepless nights. She ran a hand over a thick binder, its contents holding the culmination of her research, the undeniable proof. A tremor went through her fingertips, not of fear, but of potent anticipation. The time for hiding, for being the victim, was over. Every late night poring over spreadsheets, every hushed conversation with a trusted ally, every step taken in secret had led her here, to this precise moment of readiness. Weeks ago, the thought of facing them again would have sent a cold dread through her. The memories of their dismissive laughter, their cruel words, the crushing weight of their injustice still pricked at the edges of her mind. But now, those memories didn't bring weakness. They fueled a burning resolve, a quiet fire that hardened her gaze and straightened her spine. She wasn't the same woman they had broken. She had rebuilt herself, piece by painstaking piece, stronger, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to their carefully constructed facade. She stood, walking to the window. The city lights twinkled below, a vast, indifferent sea. Taking a deep breath, she felt the tension in her shoulders ease, replaced by a focused calm. Her reflection in the glass showed not the haunted eyes of the past, but a face etched with determination, a nascent power simmering beneath the surface. She practiced her opening words in her mind, the cadence steady, the message clear and irrefutable. There would be no hesitation this time, no wavering. She had armed herself with truth, strategy, and an unshakable belief in her cause. The final preparations were complete. The stage was set. Her return was imminent, and the payback she had so long envisioned was finally within reach. The scent of sizzling grease and stale disinfectant still clung to the air, a familiar and unwelcome perfume that tightened something deep within her chest. She pushed open the heavy glass door, the small bell above jingling just as it always had. The lunchtime rush was in full swing, the clatter of plates and the murmur of voices creating a chaotic symphony she knew intimately. But this time, she wasn't wearing a faded uniform. Her hands weren't raw from scrubbing, and her eyes weren't downcast. She stood tall, encased in a perfectly tailored suit that whispered of quiet luxury, a stark contrast to the worn vinyl booths and fluorescent glare of the restaurant floor. He looked up from behind the counter, his face etched with the same perpetual scowl she remembered. Mr. Henderson. Time seemed to have added more gray to his temples, but hadn't softened the hard edges around his eyes. He didn't recognize her at first. Customers jostled past, ordering burgers and fries, oblivious to the potent moment unfolding by the entrance. Then his gaze lingered, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. A woman stepped out of the kitchen, wiping sweat from her brow. It was Brenda, who had always seemed to find joy in making others miserable. She spotted her too, a look of disbelief spreading across her face, quickly replaced by suspicion. Brenda nudged Mr. Henderson, whispering furiously. Recognition dawned on him, a wave of shock washing over his face, leaving him momentarily speechless. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the ambient noise fading as her presence commanded the space. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, the click of her expensive heels unnaturally loud on the worn tile floor. Her gaze swept over them, not with anger, but with a profound, calm assurance. There was no need for theatrics. Her very being here like this was the performance. Mr. Henderson finally found his voice, sputtering slightly.
You! What are you doing here? Customers only! Get out of the staff area!
His voice held the same old bluster, the same dismissal she had endured for years. A slow smile touched her lips, devoid of humor, full of quiet power.
Actually, Mr. Henderson, I believe I am the customer today. A rather important one.
Her voice was low, steady, carrying an authority he had never heard from her before. Brenda scoffed, stepping closer, her arms crossed.
Important? Look, whatever you're selling, we're not buying. You got fired, remember? Trying to cause trouble.
Her tone was dripping with condescension, the familiar venom sparking in her eyes. She held up a small, sleek device, tapping the screen.
No trouble, Brenda. Just closure. You see, the investment firm I now manage recently acquired a portfolio of distressed properties. Imagine my surprise when I saw this address listed.
Mr. Henderson's jaw dropped. Brenda paled, her smug expression dissolving into a look of utter horror. The scattered customers nearby, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began to quiet down, watching. She lowered the device, her eyes locking onto theirs.
I came to see the old place and to deliver a message. Your treatment of me, it had consequences you never anticipated. It didn't break me, it built me. And now the future of this establishment rests in my hands.
A profound silence fell over the restaurant, broken only by the distant hum of the kitchen refrigerator. The smell of grease suddenly felt less oppressive, more like a fading memory. Justice served not with anger or vengeance, but with undeniable, powerful success. The air in the grand ballroom seemed to thicken, growing heavy with unspoken words and arrested breaths. All eyes were fixed on the platform where Ilera stood, not as the overlooked employee or the dismissed hopeful, but as a visionary, validated by a titan of industry. Among the hushed crowd, clustered near the edges, were faces that had haunted Ilera's past. The colleagues who had snickered, the patrons who had doubted, the superiors who had casually crushed her spirit with indifference. Their shock was a palpable force, freezing smiles mid-reach for canapes and stilling the ripple of conversation. Disbelief etched lines around their eyes. They saw Ilara, radiant and confident, standing beside the formidable Mr. Sterling, a man whose approval was the stuff of their own highest ambitions. The scent of expensive flowers and aged wood suddenly felt cloying, tightening around their chests. This wasn't just Ilara. This was their Ilara, the one they had deemed too quiet, too strange, too insignificant. A woman with a sharp bob, who had once laughed openly at Ilara's ideas, now stood frozen, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. A former manager, who had once told Ilara she lacked the right kind of ambition, swallowed hard, his collar suddenly feeling impossibly tight. Envy, sharp and bitter as unripe fruit, twisted their guts. They had dismissed her as a footnote, a failure, someone they could forget. Now, she was the headline, the success story unfolding right before their eyes, ushered onto the stage by the very power brokers they courted. The irony was a cruel twist of the knife. They who believed they understood the rules of success, the importance of connections and outward confidence, were forced to witness the quiet, persistent soul they had overlooked receive the ultimate validation from within the very fortress of influence they longed to breach. The whispers that began to snake through the room were low and tinged with a mixture of awe and resentment.
I don't understand. How?
One woman muttered, her voice barely a breath, directed at no one in particular.
Sterling? Him? Partnering with her?
A man near her scoffed, though the sound was hollow, devoid of its usual arrogance. The discomfort was thick enough to cut with a knife. They wanted to look away, to deny the reality of it, but a morbid fascination, a need to understand the depth of their own misjudgment, held their gazes captive. Mr. Sterling, the magnate whose presence commanded the room, subtly shifted his weight. He wasn't observing the main presentation. His calm gaze swept across the faces of the former colleagues. He saw their stunned silence, their forced smiles, the shame and regret flickering in their eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips. It wasn't triumphant or cruel, but held the quiet satisfaction of witnessing a balance restored, of seeing genuine worth finally recognized over shallow pretense. Justice, in this moment, wore a quiet, knowing expression. The spotlights hit her like a warm embrace, not the harsh glare she'd once flinched from. The air in the grand hall hummed with anticipation, thick with the scent of success and the low murmur of impressed voices. This was it, the culmination. Not just a project launch, but a declaration. A full, undeniable emergence into the stratosphere of her chosen field. She stood taller than ever before, the fabric of her tailored suit feeling like a second skin, imbued with the resilience she had painstakingly built. Every polished surface reflected the glow emanating from her. And it wasn't just the stage lights. It was the inner light she had finally unearthed, forged in the crucible of unbearable pain. The dismissive words, the cruel laughter, the calculated sabotage. They hadn't broken her. They had tempered her spirit, sharpening her focus, igniting a fire that now burned brilliantly for all to see. She remembered the suffocating despair, the tears that tasted like salt and defeat, the gnawing fear that she was truly worthless. But that past agony was now the bedrock of her power. It was the fuel that had propelled her through sleepless nights of work, the whisper that urged her to innovate where others conformed, the deep understanding that made her connect with her audience on a level no one else could. She stepped forward to speak, and the murmurs quieted. Her voice, once trembling with uncertainty, now resonated with clear authority and quiet confidence. It carried the weight of experience, the wisdom born from hardship. She spoke of her journey, weaving the narrative of challenges faced not as obstacles, but as necessary steps. She didn't dwell on the negativity, but the audience, many of whom knew the whispers of her past, heard the unspoken story beneath her words. They saw the victory in her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. They felt the profound moral lesson in her presence, that even from the darkest places, one could rise, powered by the very forces that sought to crush them. Out in the crowd, faces she hadn't seen in years were visible, the same faces that had worn smirks or looks of indifference. Now, their expressions ranged from stunned disbelief to grudging admiration, maybe even a hint of regret. The bullies who had tried to bury her alive were now witnessing her bloom. There was no need for grand pronouncements of revenge. Her success was the loudest statement imaginable. It was a taste sweeter than any planned retribution, a scent of justice more potent than victory speeches. She hadn't just survived, she had transcended. She wasn't merely back. She was shining brighter than she ever could have in the shadows they tried to confine her to. Her brilliance wasn't a fleeting spark, but a steady, radiant star illuminating a path forward, not just for herself, but for anyone who dared to believe that past pain could become future power. It had been a long, arduous journey from that day of crushing public humiliation. Looking back, she could trace the path, marked not just by the tears she had shed, but by the quiet strength she had discovered coiled deep within her. The world had seemed to collapse, the laughter and whispers like shards of glass, tearing at her very sense of self. Her dignity felt stripped bare, left exposed under the harsh glare of judgment. But stories like hers, she now understood, were more than just a sequence of painful events. They were tapestries woven with the threads of resilience. She remembered the suffocating shame, the feeling of utter powerlessness that had threatened to drown her. Yet in the darkest moments, flickering embers of defiance had remained, refusing to be extinguished entirely. Unexpected kindness, like a cool drink in a desert, had emerged from places she had never anticipated. A quiet word, a steady hand, a belief in her when she had none left for herself. These moments, small as they might have seemed to the givers, had been monumental, lifeline thrown to a drowning spirit. They taught her that even in a world capable of profound cruelty, there existed a wellspring of empathy and goodness. Finding strength after humiliation was not an overnight transformation. It was a gradual process, like bones knitting back together, stronger for having been broken. It was learning to stand tall, not despite the scars, but with them, recognizing them as proof of survival, not defeat. The overarching moral was clear, etched into her soul. True worth resided not in the validation of others, nor could it be erased by their malice. It was an intrinsic flame that could be dimmed but never truly extinguished. Her journey was an inspirational message to anyone who had ever felt small, attacked, or dismissed. It was a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure, to find allies in unlikely places, and to rebuild one's sense of self, brick by painstaking brick, into something unshakable. The fight for justice, for dignity, was not always loud or dramatic. Often, it was a quiet, internal battle fought one breath, one step, one day at a time. And she had won. And so, the echoes of the past began to soften, no longer a cacophony of pain, but a reminder of how far she had come. The sharp edges of memory smoothed with the passage of time, leaving behind a quiet sense of peace. She carried the lessons with her, etched into the lines of her hands, whispered on the wind that tousled her hair. The humiliation had been a crucible, forging a stronger, more compassionate person. The kindness, a balm that healed and restored faith. Her story, once defined by hurt, was now a narrative of courage, a testament to the quiet, persistent power of one soul refusing to be broken. The world could throw its worst, but some spirits, fortified by resilience and the light of unexpected grace, simply could not be extinguished. Justice had found its way, not just in consequence for the cruel, but in the profound restoration of a life nearly lost, now shining brighter than before. She was, irrevocably, more than just a story of suffering. She was a story of triumph,